Hey everybody, my name is Dr. Scott Giacomucci, and I'm the author of Trauma-Informed Principles in Group Therapy, Psychodrama, and Organizations, Action Methods for Leadership. And today, I wanted to take some time to talk a little bit about the 6 trauma-informed principles outlined by SAMHSA and their relationship to trauma in general. So this video is going to pull from content from chapters 5 through 10 in the book, and provide a simple overview of the relevance of the 6 trauma-informed principles for anybody working with trauma survivors in any context. So it makes a lot of sense that SAMHSA would prioritize safety as the very first of the 6 trauma-informed principles. Of course, trauma in many ways is an experience that disrupts or threatens our sense of safety. It's almost like the opposite of safety. Trauma is the opposite of safety. So when we're working with trauma survivors, especially when we're doing any kind of trauma therapy, we really have to prioritize safety in our work. And there's lots of different types of safety, right? Many people, because of their upbringing and the society they grow up in or their identity, may have never felt absolute safety. And so providing a sense of safety, relative safety at least, in our services, in our organizations, can be really healing just by itself. Now, there's at least 5 different layers of safety. We have physical safety. This is attending to the layout of the building, the lighting in the parking lot, other aspects of physical safety, thinking about how your furniture might be arranged in your office. Do we have clients positioned in a way where their back is to the door or where they're able to clearly get to exits? That can really help people feel safer physically. The second layer of safety has to do with emotional and psychological safety. So this is probably what we're usually thinking of when we're thinking of safety as it relates to trauma, in that we really want to help people to feel emotionally safe in their environment, in the relationships, and just psychologically reconnecting with a sense of safety within their self, within their mind, within their brain again. Third level of safety has to do with relationships and social safety. So this is about helping clients or individuals feel a sense of safety in the relationship, within a group, or within the community, within an organization. Next layer of safety has to do with culture. So helping people feel safe regardless of what their culture is. Many times this has to do with the ways that we're representing our organization, or the representation or lack of representation within our organization in terms of diversity, in terms of identity, in terms of cultural values. What are the guiding principles and core values and mission of an organization and the work culture within it? And how is that congruent or contradictory to different cultural values that somebody might be bringing with them as they're receiving services or working within an organization? Many people experience trauma because of their cultural background, because of their identity, and we need to make sure we're attending to safety in this way for the folks that we're working with. And the 5th layer of safety has to do with moral safety. So are we challenging people's morals in a way that disrupts their sense of safety? Are we contributing to moral injury that they might experience because of the trauma? Are we asking our clients, or are we asking our staff to do things that go against their morals, against their ethical principles? So these are the 5 layers of safety that we have to attend to for clients, for colleagues, for coworkers within our organization. So incorporating trauma-informed principle of safety means that we create spaces that promote safety on all these levels within the agency. And we have to really reflect on, how exactly are we addressing safety on each of these levels for our clients? So I challenge you to take a moment and reflect on that. Consider each of these 5 levels as it relates to the work you do with clients. Maybe consider which of these 5 types of safety do you feel most equipped to work to. Perhaps consider which of these 5 layers of safety you feel most competent in helping to cultivate and establish with clients? And which of these 5 layers of safety do you feel like perhaps you overlook at times and you might benefit from focusing more on in your work? So, anytime we're working with trauma survivors, we really have to start with safety. Again, safety itself can be really healing and really corrective for trauma survivors. This is especially true if we're working with folks that have experienced recent trauma or in the midst of crisis. Just providing a safe landing place for them, a holding environment for them, attunement, and a safe relationship can really be not just healing, but also preventative in the trauma they're recently or currently experiencing from turning into PTSD in the future. Stephen Porges and other experts in the field remind us that in many ways, safety is the treatment when we're working with trauma. SAMHSA also reminds us that we don't get to define what safety is for our clients. Safety is really a subjective experience, and that everyone's experience of safety is going to be slightly different or maybe even drastically different than other people's experience of safety. So we have to define safety through the eyes of our client. This means that we have to check in. We have to keep an open dialogue about safety. We have to ask for feedback. We have to inquire about what are the things that are important to the folks we're working with in terms of helping them feel safe and helping them feel safer. So, of course, many people have been challenging the idea of safe spaces and suggesting that for many people, based on their identity, based on marginalization they experience, or microaggressions and systemic oppression and racism, that there's no such thing as absolute safety and a safe place. And instead, it might be helpful to slightly reframe the way we're talking about safe places and instead talk about safer places. We talk about safety as a relative experience, that things can always be and feel a little bit more safer and a little bit less safe. So this can be really helpful in how we're thinking about safety. It's not just you're either safe or you're not. It's more of a spectrum, more or less safety that we can be cultivating. Now, of course, this is focused just on the second of the 6 trauma-informed principles outlined by SAMHSA. And it's important to note that these 6 principles really go together. We can't fully cultivate trustworthiness and transparency without also addressing the other 5 trauma-informed principles. So I encourage you to check out some of the other videos on this channel to learn more about the other trauma-informed principles as they relate to trauma recovery, as they relate to group therapy, to psychodrama practice, and to leadership and organizations. Now, trauma and PTSD at their fundamental level really rupture a sense of trust within the self, within others and relationships, and within the world. When we experience trauma, it so often takes place within relationships, and it can be in the form of betrayal or abandonment or neglect or violence or abuse or harm. And it leads to difficulty trusting others and feeling safe with others. Other types of trauma, like natural disasters or other tragedies, might leave our trust in humanity or our trust just in the world shook and shaken. Trauma really can disrupt our sense of trust in others in the world, whereas PTSD really can disrupt our sense of self, our sense of trust in ourselves. PTSD and trauma can really disrupt our sense of trust in ourselves. In the aftermath of trauma, while experiencing traumatic stress, it's pretty common to struggle to know what's real and what's not real, to almost lose a sense of trust in our own body. Is our body our sense? Can we trust our senses? Is what we're seeing, what we're feeling, what we're sensing, is it related to what's happening here and now? Or is it being triggered and related to that past trauma that we experienced? Can we even trust our thoughts in our decision making in the aftermath of trauma? I mean, PTSD by its nature leaves us with negative moods and feelings and negative and distorted beliefs about ourselves, others, and the world. So at its core, Trauma and PTSD involve a rupture of trust in ourselves, trust in others, and trust in the world. I think collective traumas also disrupt our sense of trust in humanity, or a sense of trust in the goodness of others. Judith Herman, who's wrote the book Trauma and Recovery and is one of the pioneers and most famous trauma experts, she describes trust as a foundational belief in the continuity of life, a sense of safety in the world, and a formative core element sustaining one throughout their life. So, on that existential level, we can see how trauma can really disrupt this foundational belief in the continuity of life, a sense of safety in the world, and this core element sustaining us throughout our life. If we experience trauma and come to believe that the world's not a safe place, that we're constantly hyper aroused about the fragility of life and our own death or the death of people around us, and we lose this trust that life will go on. We lose this trust in the continuity of life. We lose the trust in the safety and goodness of the world, the benefits of living, of having relationships. It really can be paralyzing and debilitating. Trust is really at the basis of all relationships and at the basis of all spirituality and faith. In moments of terror or trauma, as humans, we'll naturally cry out for those that we most trust. Usually these are our caregivers, our parents, our partners, or God. And in the moment of trauma, if this cry for help or comfort goes unanswered, trauma survivors' basic sense of trust and faith in the world and in others can be completely destroyed. Judith Herman says, when trust is lost, traumatized people feel that they belong more to the dead than to the living. A loss of trust in the world, loss of trust in relationships, and trust in oneself, in our own senses, are really core to trauma and PTSD. Again, so much of trauma happens because of other human beings betraying our trust in them, or simply because of other human beings in general, which can make it really hard to trust other human beings in the future, to feel safe in relationships. This is especially true for complex trauma and complex PTSD. And in any discussion of trauma-informed principles, it's important that we keep in mind that these 6 principles really go together. We can't fully talk about one of them without considering the other. So while this chapter is devoted to the 3rd trauma-informed principles, it would be important to check out some of the other videos and reflect on the other 5 trauma-informed principles as they relate to peer support. Of course, trauma is inherently disconnecting and isolating, and it often leaves us with symptoms and effects that make our relationships really difficult. This is especially true when we experience relational trauma that takes place in the context of relationships. It can disrupt our ability to feel safe with others, to trust others, and to engage in any kind of social support or peer support. Trauma creates a disconnection between self and others. It impacts our attachment styles, our template for relating to others. It can leave us with a sense of mistrust for others. And it can make us more prone to relational reenactments, where we tend to unconsciously reenact unhealthy relationship patterns from the past. It can leave us feeling alone and isolated, like we're detached from others, or how could anyone possibly understand what we've been through? Or maybe we have so much shame and blame ourselves for it. We feel like we're worthless and don't have anything to contribute to relationships. Trauma can result in a sense of helplessness and worthlessness, feeling like we have nothing to offer the world, that we're no good. It creates an unbalanced relationship. When we experience trauma, there's a power dynamic that gets unbalanced between a victim and a perpetrator. And this power dynamic can really leave one feeling unsafe and unsettled, disempowered. So it makes sense that SAMHSA would would elevate peer support to the third trauma-informed principle. And that peer support offers a remedy for a balanced peer-to-peer connection that can promote a sense of worth and empowerment. So before diving into this, I want to highlight how these 6 trauma-informed principles, although we're going to talk about them separately, they really go hand in hand. We can't fully embody collaboration and mutuality, the spirit of it, without also considering the other 5 trauma-informed principles. So I encourage you to check out some of the other videos on the channel here to familiarize yourself with the other 5 trauma-informed principles. So collaboration and mutuality, these two go hand in hand. And collaboration, of course, means that we're approaching the work through the spirit of partnership, of collaboration. And mutuality is about a mutual respect, that we're seeing the goodness and the positive qualities within the other. Of course, in the moment of trauma, mutuality completely disintegrates. There is no mutual respect in the moment of trauma. And the possibility of collaboration is entirely lost in a moment of trauma. Instead, there's a resulting sense of unworthiness and self-hatred, which can really complicate a trauma survivor's search for belonging, for self-love, and for purpose. Group work and psychodrama offer avenues for participants to experience and engage in collaboration and mutuality while recovering that self-worth and experiencing a sense of belonging within the group experience. Same is possible in organizational settings, that there's a real possibility for a healing and restorative sense of mutuality within an organization, mutual respect between colleagues, and a sense of belonging in a healthy organization. Collaboration and belonging are equally important in organizations as they help staff feel a part of, and they help staff feel purpose-driven and valued. Trauma is really characterized by the absence of collaboration and mutuality. There's no room for authentic collaboration or mutuality in the midst of trauma, in the midst of collective trauma such as racism or sexism, gender violence, or any kind of discrimination. The extraordinary imbalance of power in trauma can only be reversed through a healing process that really centers collaboration and centers mutuality within that healing process. Collaboration means that trauma survivors must be approached as active agents in their own healing process, rather than simply as patients that are receiving treatment from a provider. Collaboration in trauma-informed care means that we do with the client rather than do for or do to the client. This is a challenge for many agencies whose practices are going to be entrenched in the medical model of treatment and bureaucratic standards, or even really sterile systems that tend to reenact power dynamics. For example, in many organizations, the process of treatment planning becomes really cookie cutter and templated jargon for compliance reasons rather than a collaborative experience with a client. Or groups start to become all manualized and sterile, and there's no room for mutual aid and collaboration. Instead, we're giving out worksheets and reading off of a script. Instead of therapists being dynamic healers in the here and now. Or we might have such stringent documentation requirements fueled by insurance companies or other regulatory demands that turn therapists into case managers and into administrators who don't actually have time to do therapy. I've seen this again and again in agencies. Therapists become so burnt out, and other staff so burnt out, and this burnout fuels more of the same, that staff are more likely to just go through the motions and follow the path of least resistance in their work, rather than to really engage creatively and authentically with the clients and with colleagues. Many times policymakers and leaders contribute to this, making decisions without frontline workers or clients who are going to be impacted by the new policies. So collaboration and mutuality are especially important. Now, there was a seminal text on trauma-informed care in 2001 from Harris and Fallett, and they state that The core of the service relationship in a trauma-informed system is open and genuine collaboration between provider and consumer at all phases of service delivery. So I want to challenge us to reflect on how can we further approach clients as active collaborators in our work with them, regardless of our role. Neutrality means that we connect with others, helping them feel seen, helping them feel heard, loved, valued, and empowered, and helping to cultivate a sense of belonging for everybody is really crucial to this effect. This means we have to develop atmospheres of mutual respect throughout our workplaces and our groups and in how we're providing services to clients. Perhaps we must look beyond only applying neutrality to trauma survivors and staff and also consider the importance of looking at trauma perpetrators through this lens as well. Many times, perpetrators are also victims of trauma. We spend a lot of time dehumanizing perpetrators, which really doesn't help them heal and doesn't help prevent future trauma. In my own work with folks with trauma, substance use, and in the prison systems, I find again and again that many times the folks who have hurt others are also folks that have been taken advantage of themselves, who have experienced their own trauma, their own loss, their own abandonment or neglect. And so I've found that the best way to help prevent future trauma is to cultivate healing for everybody, including perpetrators. We can't just dehumanize them and write them off. We really have to also work towards healing for everybody. So I want to challenge us to also see perpetrators most of the time as human beings who are also in pain themselves. Furthermore, we also have to apply this sense of mutual respect to ourselves. Many times as helping professionals, we might be quick to offer mutual respect to others, but we might not show the same respect and care to ourselves. This means that we have to recognize our own needs, our own wants, our own strengths, and our own goodness. We're going to really struggle to collaborate with others until we come to believe that our own ideas are also worth consideration. And it's good role modeling for clients and for those that we're working with. Implementing these trauma-informed principles really requires the vehicle of a relationship between two parties for them to manifest. We can't engage in collaboration unless we're collaborating with somebody else. It's not something that can be done alone. I want to challenge us to pause for a moment and reflect on some questions. Or do I fully recognize my own worth, my own strengths as a professional and as a human being? And how can those that I work with further recognize their inherent worth and strengths? How can I help them further recognize that their ideas are important, that their past experience is meaningful, and that they bring something important to the table that's worth exploring and collaborating with? So trauma, by its nature, is inherently disempowering for trauma survivors. The trauma can be characterized by unspeakable terror, helplessness, powerlessness, which are fundamentally disempowering. In most cases, the victim of trauma has their voice, their choice, and their power taken from them. So it makes sense that SAMHSA would really elevate this as a trauma-informed principle: voice, choice, and empowerment. A traumatic experience often disintegrates one's sense of personal power, mastery, control, confidence. Trauma, as well as traumatic stress, can really impact one's ability to speak up and feel like they have a voice in the aftermath of that trauma. I mean, so much of the work that we end up doing in trauma therapy and trauma recovery is about helping clients find their voice and use their voice. In the midst of trauma, a victim often cries out for help, but might feel a sense of abandonment or voicelessness when nobody responds, or the people or systems that were supposed to be there to protect them, to prevent this type of thing from happening, abandon their authority and don't. There can be a real mistrust that develops in the aftermath of trauma, a distrust that nobody's going to listen, nobody's going to respond next time I ask for help because they didn't respond when I really needed them. There can be this sense of learned voicelessness or learned helplessness that develops in the aftermath of trauma. Learned voicelessness, although it can sound like it's about the trauma survivor's lack of ability to speak up, But it's less about their ability to speak up and more about their lack of confidence in people or systems to respond when they do speak up. And this sort of voicelessness even has some neurobiological grounding in that in neuroscience studies related to trauma, when they ask someone to remember a traumatic experience and they take a brain scan at that moment and they look at parts of the brain that are active or that are less active or inactive, one of the parts of the brain that's entirely shut down is the Broca's area, which is the speech and language part of the brain. And so this finding has really challenged us as therapists, especially, to reconsider the effectiveness of talk therapy alone. If the speech and language part of the brain is shut down when somebody's remembering a traumatic experience, thinking about a traumatic experience, how helpful is just talking about it going to be? This finding also really validates what every trauma survivor knows, is that it's really hard to find words to talk about the trauma. We don't want to talk about it. It's painful to talk about it. It's hard to talk about it. And it's really difficult to convey the experience of it because it's so overwhelming. Trauma's devastating impact on one's sense of empowerment, choice, and voice make each of these principles essential to a trauma-informed approach. A trauma survivor's power, their voice, and their choice are so often diminished. Therefore, our approaches must orient around restoring power or empowering, emphasizing their voice and their choices. In the context of power and empowerment, we should differentiate between personal power and an abuse of power. Sometimes trauma survivors can kind of flip-flop back and forth between powerlessness or reenacting unhealthy power dynamics in relationships. Empowerment is really about a restoration of neutrality, voice, and choice. It's about power with and power to and power within, rather than having power over others. And there's a lot that's been written about those differentiations. I want to challenge us to reflect on how are we elevating the voices of our clients and avoiding reenactments of abandonment? In what specific ways do we promote choice and autonomy in our work with trauma survivors? In my work, it's one of the first things that I do is I emphasize the client's right to choose how much they want to participate, what they want to share and when, how much they want to share, in what way they want to share or talk about their trauma in terms of specifics or in a general way. In my groups, all the clients know they have the option to participate, to observe. They have a choice about everything. That forcing somebody to do trauma therapy or forcing somebody to talk about trauma before they're ready to is really not helpful, and it's potentially harmful. So in this video, we're going to be talking about identity and how it plays a role and impacts us and everybody else in the context of group therapy, in psychodrama practice, and in organizations. While this video is going to specifically focus on the sixth trauma-informed principle, it's also important to note that all six of the trauma-informed principles really go hand in hand. We can't just focus on this sixth principle without also considering the other five principles. So if you're not familiar with those other five principles, I encourage you to check out the other videos on this YouTube channel and the other chapters of the book where I go into detail about all six of SAMHSA's trauma-informed principles. What I noticed in my research is that this sixth principle about identity does not seem to be included in the early definitions of trauma-informed care and in the early lists of trauma-informed principles. If you go on Google and search for trauma-informed principles, you'll still find older lists that only include the first five principles and did not include this sixth principle, which I think is really disheartening and just unfortunate. We really, really can't embody trauma-informed care philosophy, the 4 R's of trauma-informed care, especially resisting re-traumatization. And we really can't embody the 5 other trauma-informed principles, safety and trust and peer support and empowerment and voice and collaboration, if we're not also addressing issues related to identity. So I really believe that this sixth trauma-informed principle is essential and really required, and it's often the one that gets most overlooked, and often the one that most individuals and organizations, I'll put myself in that category too, have the most room to grow in. So when we think about trauma, we have to keep in mind that trauma is always going to be contextualized within an individual's identity. That the gender, the age, the race, the ethnicity, the cultural belief systems, the religion, citizenship, all these different aspects of identity are going to play a role in how an individual experiences the world and how an individual experiences adversity. So we can't fully understand anybody's experience of trauma if we're not also considering their experience, their identity, and how it impacts their experience. SAMHSA states that culture is the lens through which reality is interpreted. Without an understanding of culture, it's difficult to gauge how individuals organize, interpret, and resolve their traumas. So this is a quote directly from SAMHSA's publications on trauma-informed care. And we have to keep in mind that many people's experience of trauma are going to be directly related to or because of their identity. This is especially true when it comes to any kind of collective trauma, identity-based trauma, discrimination, gender violence, oppression. These are all real traumas, and they're traumas experienced specifically because of some aspect of somebody's identity. So things like discrimination, racism, racial trauma, these are all strongly related and correlated with PTSD diagnosis. So it's important that we're expanding our definition of trauma to include these types of collective traumas. And in many ways, I like to think of racism, discrimination, oppression as more closely related to complex trauma than being related to a single incident trauma, in that they're often happening again and again and again and again, reenactments of it, microaggressions, new harms through society, through relationships, through communities, through organizations. And there's just layers and layers and layers of additional harm caused. So when we're talking about collective trauma, what we're talking about is when an entire group of people experiences traumatization. And this is often based on either violence directed to that entire group based on their group identity, or discrimination, or sometimes we could think of collective trauma as being related to geographical proximity. For example, if there's a natural disaster and an entire group of people in the same geographical proximity are impacted, they're experiencing a shared experience because of their physical location. Whereas most types of collective trauma are more related to shared experience based on social location. So lots of different types of collective trauma. Collective trauma could include things like natural disasters, earthquakes, war, community violence, terrorism, genocide, poverty, famine, pandemics like the COVID-19 pandemic, and any other form of systemic oppression or discrimination. The symptoms of collective trauma are going to manifest in our collective bodies. This comes from some ideas and theories from Thomas Hubble in the book Collective Trauma. So the symptoms of individual trauma show up within our individual bodies and psyches. The symptoms of collective trauma are going to show up within our collective bodies and collective psyches, within our groups, within our communities, within our organizations, and within all of society. So in that same book, Hubble and Everett explain that collective traumas distort social narratives. They rupture national identities and hinder the development of institutions, communities, and cultures. just as personally experienced trauma has the power to disrupt the psychological development of a growing child. I think this is a pretty powerful idea and really illustrates the widespread impact of collective trauma. That many times we think about just the individual's experience and long term effects of a collective trauma, but we also have to consider the collective impacts and the macro impacts of collective trauma. And the research and writing and prevalence of discussions about collective trauma and about ancestral trauma really continues to grow in the field. Oppression and discrimination based on one's identity can manifest in a variety of adverse conditions. It can show up as classical post traumatic stress symptoms. It can emerge as emotional distress, hyperarousal, alienation, isolation, anxiety, being worried about the future, having a fear of other people, difficulty coping with emotions, a loss of safety in the world, negative beliefs about ourselves, others, or the world, avoidance behaviors, disturbing images, flashbacks, nightmares of re experiencing, dissociation and numbing behaviors, depression, anger, rage, low self esteem, shame, and other forms of post traumatic stress. So, like I said, the pervasive and ongoing nature of identity based trauma, discrimination, and oppression is quite similar to the impacts of complex trauma. And I think thinking about it through the lens of complex trauma can be really helpful and give us a basis of understanding, a basis of how to talk about it, and basis for treating and cultivating healing. So, this sixth trauma informed principle about gender, culture, and history, although they state it as just being about gender, culture, and history, it's really larger than that, and it has to do with all aspects of identity. There's a framework for identity that I found really helpful for myself in my own learning, in my own practice, and my own teaching, which is the addressing model by Pamela Hayes. So, the addressing model outlines a multidimensional theory or conceptualization of identity and of intersectionality. So, it's called the addressing model because the word addressing becomes an acronym for the different layers of identity. The A corresponds to age and generational influences. The two D's are combined together in the acronym to represent developmental and acquired disabilities. The R in addressing has to do with religion and spiritual orientation. The E is about ethnicity and racial identity. The first S represents social class, culture, and structures. The second S is about sexual orientation. The I in addressing is about indigenous heritage or lack of. The N has to do with nationality and national origin. And the G is about gender. So the addressing model provides us with a framework for understanding layers of identity and intersectionality. So awareness and acknowledgement of identity is the first step. So we have to be aware of our own identities, our own gender, our own age, our own privilege and marginalization. But awareness and acknowledgement alone is simply not enough. It has to be followed with action and responsiveness. Otherwise, just acknowledging it can just be performative and doesn't relate to any real change. So I want to challenge you for a moment to reflect on these different categories in Pamela Hayes' addressing model and to consider in which of these layers of identity do you hold privileged positions in? And in which of these layers of identity do you hold marginalized positions in? And how might your identities intersect with the identities of the clients that you're working with. How often are you working with clients who have marginalized or privileged positions within these different layers of identity? So there's another framework called healing-centered engagement that was created by Sean Ginswright, which seems to really build off of trauma-informed care philosophy while also adding an additional emphasis on the importance of culture and identity, on strength-based approaches, and on conceptualizing trauma as a collective and systemic experience rather than just an individual wound. So I really encourage you to check out Sean Ginswright's publications and videos, as he really obviously is going to articulate his theory better than I could. Some of the basics of healing-centered engagement are that he suggests that trauma-informed is a deficit-oriented term in that it's focusing on the trauma by the nature of calling it trauma-informed. And instead, he proposes the term healing-centered engagement as a strength-based way of renegotiating even the name that we're giving to our philosophy, which I really like, to be honest. It's really in alignment with the way that I think about trauma healing and the emphasis on post-traumatic growth in my teaching and in my clinical work, and even the namesake of my organization being the Phoenix Center, which is focused on the growth after the trauma, the rising from the ashes, rather than just focusing on the trauma itself. So I really like how Sean is challenging us to think about the work and to name the work through a strengths-based perspective, healing-centered engagement as opposed to trauma-informed practice. Sean goes further and suggests that the environment is often the root cause of trauma, and that trauma-informed care is far too medicalized and too individualized, focusing on individual treatment without offering guidance for addressing the causes of trauma within neighborhoods, families, schools, and larger society. And I think this is really true. The way that trauma-informed care has been absorbed within the field, within our highly medicalized and individualized treatment plans and industries, I think there's really something, there's some truth in this. I would argue that the actual philosophy of trauma-informed care is much less medicalized and individualized than the ways it's been integrated into practice. In healing-centered engagement, there's 4 key elements within this framework. The first is that healing-centered engagement is explicitly political rather than clinical. So there's an emphasis on politics and society rather than an emphasis on clinical. Second is that healing-centered engagement is culturally grounded and views healing as a restoration of identity. I think that's pretty powerful. Healing-centered engagement is culturally grounded, so the practices are grounded and rooted within the culture of the community that's being worked with and engaged with. And healing is being viewed and defined as a restoration of identity. So that would suggest that the trauma is causing a disconnection or a rupture in one's connection to their identity. And I think this is particularly true with collective trauma. The third key element is that healing-centered engagement is asset-driven and focuses on well-being rather than on symptoms. So in this way, it's really a humanistic approach, a strength-based approach, kind of congruent with positive psychology and humanistic psychology. And the fourth key aspect is that healing-centered engagement supports providers in engaging in their own healing. And I really love this about healing-centered engagement. I think it's something that probably could have been emphasized more in trauma-informed care philosophy, that the healing and the well-being of the provider, the professional, the therapist, the leader, is of utmost importance. that if we haven't attended to our own well being as professionals, we're going to be pretty limited in helping others achieve a state of well being as well. So, these are the four key areas of healing centered engagement. In my experience of learning about healing centered engagement, I feel like it really encompasses trauma informed care, expands on trauma informed care, and then really emphasizes this sixth trauma informed principle of issues of identity, gender, history, and culture. It seems like healing centered engagement is really re emphasizing many of the components that are present in trauma informed care philosophy that often get lost in the translation from the theory and philosophy into the actual practice.